Welcome to Hub History, where we go far beyond the Freedom Trail to share our favorite stories from the history of Boston, the hub of the universe. This is episode 154, Black Politics and Partisanship in Late 19th-Century Boston. Hi, I'm Jake. This week I'm talking to historian Millington Bergeson-Lockwood about his book Race Over Party, about the evolution of partisanship and political loyalty among Boston's African-American community. It goes from just after the Civil War until the dawn of the 20th century. It was a period that at first seemed to hold a lot of promise for political and economic advancement for African Americans, but it ended with the rise of lynching and codified Jim Crow laws in the South. It was also a period that began with near universal support for Lincoln's Republican Party among African Americans, with Frederick Douglass commenting, "The Republican Party is the ship, and all else is the sea." However, after decades of setbacks and roadblocks on the path of progress, many began to question their support of the GOP, and some tried to forge a new, non-partisan path to Black advancement. Dr. Bergeson-Lockwood will tell us how the movement developed and whether it ultimately achieved its goals. We have an extensive author interview this week, so we're skipping the Boston Book Club. But before we get to that, it's time for this week's upcoming historical event. This week we're featuring another Charter Day event from the Partnership of Historic Bostons. We featured another one of their events a few weeks ago, but as a reminder, the Partnership is a local group focusing on the historical relationship between Boston, Massachusetts and Boston, Lincolnshire. Charter Day is celebrated on September 7th, commemorating the day in 1630 when Boston, Dorchester, and Watertown were all officially named. The Partnership has a series of lectures and walking tours throughout September and October as part of their celebration, and you can find out more about that at historicbostons.org. One of the last events in this year's series is a talk by Peter Drummey of the Massachusetts Historical Society on October 23rd called Puritans in Print, Historiography of the Puritans in Literature. I've seen Drummey present a few times at MHS on topics from the relationship between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson to the legacy of Abraham Lincoln in Boston, so this should be an event to look forward to. Here's how the Partnership describes this one. From the 1630s to the 1930s, the Puritans were stigmatized and chastised in literature as dour, joyless, and oppressing. H.L. Mencken's epigram, "Puritanism is the haunting fear that someone somewhere may be happy," summarizes much of the first 300 years of Puritan historiography. But against the background of the Great War, Depression, and Prohibition, the heavens began to open and Puritan society was examined in a new light. In 1930, historian S.E. Morrison wrote, "My attitude toward 17th century Puritanism has passed through scorn and boredom to a warm interest and respect." How did the literary portrayal of Puritans change, and how does that change help us understand our national history? Note that even though Mr. Drummey works at the Mass Historical Society, that's not where the talk's being held. It'll be held in the Blue Sky Lounge in Commons at Suffolk Law School at 6 p.m. on Wednesday, October 23rd. Advanced registration is required, and while admission is free, donations are deeply appreciated. We'll have the link you need in this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/154. I'm about to play my interview with Millington Bergeson-Lockwood, and when I do, consider whether conversations like this are worth even $2 a month to you. While podcasts are free to listen to, making them costs real money. We enjoy doing the research and writing that goes into every episode, so if you enjoy listening to them, I hope you'll consider offsetting the cost of making Hub History by supporting us on Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/hubhistory or visit hubhistory.com and click on the support link. And if you already support the show, thank you very much. We appreciate each and every one of you. Now it's time for this week's interview. Dr. Millington W. Bergeson-Lockwood is a historian of race, law, and politics in the 19th century. Last year he published a book called Race Over Party, Black Politics and Partisanship in Late 19th-Century Boston. It's an era and a topic that I know embarrassingly little about, so I was glad when he agreed to call in and talk about his work, even though there was a 5-hour time zone difference between us. Dr. Bergeson-Lockwood, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So first of all, just as an aside for our listeners, you're joining us from Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So first of all, congratulations on being our furthest podcast guest. Do you mind if I ask what took you there?
Sure. So I'm here with my family doing some international development work in the Congo.
And before the DRC, where was home for you?
We've traveled around. I'm from Washington, D.C. originally, but we were in Lilongwe, Malawi before this. That's where I actually did a lot of the final writing of Race Over Party, living in Lilongwe, Malawi. Generally, Africa has been home for the last 5 years or so.
So as the subtitle of the book indicates, it's about Black politics and partisanship in Boston. And
correct.
It focuses on the time period from right after the Civil War through the turn of the 20th century. So there seem to be three elements that make the book really unique. It's set in that Reconstruction era. It looks at politics in the African-American community, and it focuses on the city of Boston. So of those three things, which one hooked you first?
You can't really tell the story of one without the other. Like, I really came to it thinking about Boston and the way that Boston's African-American history had been told as mostly a pre-Civil War story. I think we talk a lot about the abolition story and the protection of fugitive slaves and this sort of triumphant march of the 54th Massachusetts into battle. I mean, even if you think about the way that public history is displayed in the city, that's very much the narrative. It's about this sort of hard-fought struggle to end slavery that culminates in this Civil War story. I was a student of that story, had really spent a lot of time with that history, and just became the more and more I learned about the history of Reconstruction, I was really dissatisfied with the widely available history of Boston sort of after the Civil War. And that the Reconstruction story we're typically told is very much a Southern-centered story for obvious and justifiable reasons. But I felt that there was a Northern story to be told, and that that the story of Black politics in Boston didn't end with the Civil War, and it didn't end with the end of slavery, but that a lot of these same actors and their descendants continue to be involved in similar causes for racial justice. And as I explored that story, this larger question of politics and partisanship started to come together. So I'm excited. I was excited to be able to tell this story. I think it's a unique story that I think adds a new sort of valence to the way that we understand Reconstruction and understand Black politics, in as far as it's connected to sort of formal structures of party politics.
It's an era in our city's history that I know little about, to the extent that Reconstruction period comes up at all. It is very much featured as a Southern story. Even new works like Second Founding by Eric Foner very much focus on that Southern story. So as somebody who has spent a lot of time abroad and before that grew up in D.C., how did you come to focus on the Boston story during that period?
I did my undergraduate degree at Boston College. And during that time, I was a African-American studies student and spent a lot of time thinking and writing about the Black community there in the antebellum era. And when I went on to do my graduate studies, I was drawn sort of back to Boston, but wanted to tell a different story. I think as I was in graduate school, I started to find myself being more of a student of the Reconstruction era rather than the antebellum era. And as I started to get more and more into the literature of Reconstruction, I wasn't finding this Northern story and so in an attempt to try to tell this story, I came back to Boston because it does loom so large in the pre-Civil War history. It's a site of this sort of amazing and powerful Black activism to end slavery. Yet it's a place that almost falls out completely in the postbellum narrative. I had a hunch that there was more going on there than had been widely told. So that's really what drove me back to Boston.
We're going to get into that sort of postbellum Reconstruction era, and we're going to be talking about the political parties, the major political parties in America. So I was hoping you could take just a second to Can you just tell us where the Democratic and Republican parties stood on issues of race in the period immediately after the Civil War?
Sure. I mean, the history of the Republican Party during this period is as the party of Lincoln, as the party of Northern Union, as the party of, ostensibly black civil rights, although that changes over the course of the 19th century. And the Democratic Party becomes the party of
the party of secession,
right? The party,
slaveholding.
It becomes it's the party of secession. It's the party of very narrow definitions of freedom. In the North, it's the party of labor in some ways in the North, but it is still very much a Southern-driven party. I like to apply a little bit more nuance to it, but the general framing is that the Republican Party is the pro-black civil rights party of the era, and the Democratic Party is the pro-white supremacist party. Although what I try to do in Race Over Party is complicate that a little bit by looking at some of those divisions through the lens of black politics. And I think what comes out is that for African Americans, particularly this core group of black independents, by the end of the 19th century, they don't see a whole lot of light between the two parties. I like to tell the story as black politics being caught between two bad choices.
I don't want to confuse readers with sort of the modern incarnations of the Republican and Democratic parties, but that's after the Civil War. That seems to be the starting point for black partisanship, is a deep loyalty to the abolitionist Republican Party.
Yeah, and I think that there's legitimate reasons for that, right? I mean, the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln. They're the party of emancipation. They're the party of Reconstruction. So a lot of your early civil rights legislation coming out of Congress is pioneered by Republicans. Yeah, there's justifiable reasons why African American voters tend Republican. What I try to do in Race Over Party is complicate this idea of loyalty and paint black voters as more pragmatic than I think some of the portrayals they've been. That it's not just about sort of loyalty for loyalty's sake based on past deeds, but it's sort of a considered political decision about which party to support.
You describe, I guess, some of the first cracks in that solidarity coming in 1872, and you focus on a speech that's actually delivered in New Orleans, not in Boston.
Right.
Can you describe who was speaking, and then I think especially who was listening to that speech?
Yeah, so in that speech that Frederick Douglass gives in New Orleans, where he sort of declares that if the Republican Party is the ship, everything else is the sea. And what I tried to do in Race Over Party was tell the story of what I called the sort of castaways of the partisan system. It's this cadre of African Americans from Boston who are willing to step outside of the Republican ship and sort of make their own way on the open ocean of partisan politics as independents. Famously, at that event is Edwin Garrison Walker, who he's the major figure that I try to tell this story through. So Edwin Garrison Walker is the son of David Walker, who's very well known to students of antebellum Boston, the sort of outspoken radical activist in the antebellum era. Edwin Garrison Walker sort of very much carries on this tradition as a sort of outspoken black freedom fighter, very outspoken against the Republican Party and very critical of the Republican Party for not doing enough for African Americans. There's this great juxtaposition in New Orleans where you have Frederick Douglass on stage giving this speech in New Orleans, but in the same audience you have black Bostonians, including Edwin Walker, who are very much willing to take the risk of stepping outside of the Republican ship and making their own way, and indeed willing to sort of create their own boat, as it will, to sort of sail themselves.
And it seems like the experience of African Americans in politics in Boston may have been different from the experience in other cities around the same time. What would have made Boston politics different?
Well, for one, voting looms very large. So African Americans in Boston have had the right to vote for a long period of time. Boston is not a place where voting begins after the Civil War. African Americans are not prohibited from voting based on race in Boston. There's other restrictions, but race isn't one of them. Boston, although there are sort of marked events of racial discrimination in Boston, it is a fairly free and open city. The schools are desegregated in the mid 1850s, and so there is access to public education. Unique to Boston, though, you do have, so it's a small community proportional to the city, but it's highly concentrated. So you have the Boston Black community very concentrated in Ward 6. It's going to become Ward 9. And that gives them a fair amount of political power in as far as they're able to elect Black representatives to the Massachusetts State House of Representatives and then to the Boston City Council. And I think that does set them apart nationally. That they're able to have sort of physical direct access to the halls of power in Massachusetts. That does make them unique. And that's a feature of the sort of residential segregation in the city, that because they are so concentrated in that one ward, that sort of gives them political power outside of their numerical minority as far as population.
And that Ward 9 is featured on the cover of the book, at least the paperback edition that I
have. Correct.
That's basically the north slope of Beacon Hill, then the flats of Beacon Hill for our listeners, the area, the most scenic part of Beacon Hill today, I would say.
Correct. If you sort of walk north from the State House, and then even now where Massachusetts General Hospital was, or where Massachusetts General Hospital is, that was a neighborhood and that before the hospital. And so you can imagine that community sort of stretching north into the north end. But the heart of Boston's Black community during the 19th century is that northern slope of Beacon Hill, sort of between Mount Vernon Street and Charles Street, or Cambridge Street.
One of the unique factors for Boston's Black population was their ability to stand for it and get elected to office. And Edwin Garrison Walker is one of the first class of African-American state representatives, members of the House of Representatives. But you discuss how Black Bostonians were able to build political resumes for themselves. It sounds like fraternal organizations were very important for building that background before one ran for office. What sort of organizations did African Americans participate in?
Famously, the sort of Prince Hall Masons, and then there's churches are also really important. You also have like political organizations. You have sort of very outspoken civil rights organizations that African Americans form that help them sort of cut their political teeth. But they very quickly move into party politics, that they have their own, like for lack of a better word, sort of African American machine politics happening in Ward 9 that is very contested, and they can contest elections and very much sort of learn urban politics through these elections and through these political organizations. They'll start African American Republican associations. They'll start African American independent political associations that sort of mesh a racial justice message with a urban political message. But they're very outspoken in the formal sphere of politics, and that's something that happens from very early on. They view the sort of official channels of politics to be an avenue of Black uplift and of Black justice.
Black women were also participating in politics, although it seems like the avenues they had were a little bit more restricted. How were Black women becoming involved in politics in Boston?
Yeah, so African American women are present in a lot of these spaces. By the 1880s, they can vote for school board. So you do actually see Black women as voters in Boston by the 1880s and 1890s. But they are a major feature in some of these Black political meetings. They are very helpful in some of the organizing that happens. By the 1880s, 1890s, you're going to see woman-run newspapers talking about Black political issues and targeting Black men in some ways as not doing enough sort of on their behalf. And so you do have, even though during the early part of Reconstruction, you don't have Black women in the sort of formal electoral political sphere as voters, they still are very much a part of that world.
So you mentioned that there were fewer restrictions on voting in Massachusetts than in many places in the early Reconstruction period. You found a survey that was done by George Ruffin in 1864 of voters. What did it tell you about who leaders were in the Black community at that time, and then also who the bulk of Black voters were?
One thing that it's kind of amazing about that document, and this is a fantastic document, if I can just give a shout out to the Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard University. They hold the collection that has this document, and it's a survey of Black voters that George Ruffin conducted, and it was an attempt to identify all the African American voters in this ward and note whether or not they were registered to vote. And so what I love about this document is I think, we have an election coming up here, and we're always talking about get out and register to vote, and are you registered to vote, and things like that. And I think what's exciting about this document is it shows that that's not a present day phenomenon. That sort of get out the vote activity was very much a part of the political activism in Boston. What I found from this document is that Black voting really cuts across class. So the Black leadership tends to be the more established classes, so the more professional classes in terms of like George Ruffin is a lawyer, Edwin Garrison Walker is a lawyer, others will be businessmen and entrepreneurs. But when it comes to who the voters are, they're everywhere from your laborers to used clothes sellers to barbers. I mean, it really cuts across all of Boston's Black class lines, which I was really excited about because the narrative of Boston has a reputation for tending towards the elite and tending to be a story of the sort of Black upper classes. And by talking about voting, it gives you a chance to really talk about the Black community broadly. And so that was sort of one of those amazing documents that helped me build this political world of Black voting in Boston.
So that get out the vote effort was happening in 1864. And then in 1866, we did have the first two African-American men elected to the Great and General Court of Massachusetts.
Yeah, so Edwin Garrison Walker is elected, and Charles Mitchell are both elected. Yeah, so Edwin Garrison Walker very early on is present in the story as he gets elected from in Charlestown in a sort of highly contested election that really establishes his political independence from the beginning. So he's elected as a Republican, but with white Irish Democratic votes to succeed in 1866. And so very early on, he sees the power in building these sort of cross-party coalitions and becomes almost immediately very outspoken in the general court.
And one of the reasons that having that Irish American support was considered remarkable, that population had been tending towards a support for the Democratic Party, right?
They are Irish Democrats, and they cross party lines to vote for Walker. And that's in part due to, Walker is an attorney, had represented a number of Irish clients. He's very strong advocate of Irish independence. Some of the Irish Fenian movements, Walker is a sort of outspoken supporter of. And so Walker has done a lot to build the support from portions of the Irish community. I don't want to overblow the sort of the friendly relations between African Americans and Irish in Boston during the period, because we know that that's not universal. But I think the story is more complicated, and that comes out in the book, that the story of Black and Irish relations during the era are a lot more complicated and contested than it merely being a story of antagonism.
For those of us who became familiar with Boston politics in the era of busing, the idea of cooperation between Irish and Black Bostonians is something to really sit up and pay attention to.
Yeah, I'm hoping that by telling the story that I tell, we might be able to shine a light on a more positive moment that might inspire us towards figuring out ways to renew those better times.
So before we go in too much depth on the relationship between Irish and Black Bostonians, I want to ask about something that happens pretty early in Walker's term as a state rep. He is going to participate in the debates around ratifying the 14th and 15th Amendments.
Yeah, so this is another reason why I think the Boston story is so important for our understanding of Reconstruction. Because Walker, so very soon after Walker is elected, the 14th Amendment comes up for state level ratification. And Walker serves on the Committee of Federal Relations that is tasked with issuing a report and recommendations around this ratification. And in Massachusetts, particularly among African Americans of sort of Walker's cohort, they're fairly outspoken against the 14th Amendment.
And for our listeners' benefit, the 14th Amendment spells out what we now know as birthright citizenship. So it's granting citizenship to formerly enslaved African Americans and, by extension, anyone born in the U.S.
Correct. Yeah. So the 14th Amendment sort of establishes birthright citizenship. It makes African Americans it overturns Dred Scott, which attempted to take away Black citizenship. The citizenship question is one. The second thing that really interests African Americans is that they want a voting provision put into the 14th Amendment. They want voting in a very meaningful way connected to citizenship. They want sort of unmediated, uncompromised voting as a right of citizenship. They're very skeptical that if voting isn't established immediately and isn't established as a citizenship right, that it will sort of be whittled away. They really want voting established in the 14th Amendment. They're also really upset with Section 2 of the 14th Amendment that basically says that if Southern states restrict Black voting, they will be penalized by a loss of representation in Congress. And that's really dissatisfying for a lot of African Americans. They view that penalty as not harsh enough. They're skeptical that it'll be enforced, and they are skeptical that it will be enough deterrent for disenfranchisement. Famously, Walker talks about that that the South was willing to lose 2/5 of representation to maintain slavery under the 3/5 compromise. That surely they would be willing to lose a little bit of representation if it meant disenfranchisement. They view the 14th Amendment as too pro-Confederate, too pro-Southern. They want much harder language preserving Black rights and preserving voting rights. And Walker, the Committee on Federal Relations pens a report of which Walker is one of the authors. And in this report, make the claim that because Walker is one of the authors, and Walker is an African American, he has more legitimacy to speak on the 14th Amendment than all the other white lawmakers who have previously authored this. That they say that they're writing from the position of those who are going to be affected by this amendment. Therefore, that gives them a greater amount of credibility. And so Walker authors this report, and he then follows it up with a very fiery speech on the floor of the Massachusetts State House. This is the first speech given by any African American on the floor of the House, and it is sort of outspoken against the amendment. He, famously says that the amendment guards against everything else but the interests of the millions of African Americans in the United States. And so that sets the next 40 years of Walker's career in motion with this speech, that the willingness of Walker to be so outspoken in opposition to a Republican Party amendment. This is the 14th Amendment is a product of the Republican Party. And for him to sort of go against the party in such an outspoken way is really going to define the politics for the rest of his life. And so I think you see almost from the immediate end of the Civil War, the way in which partisan politics and racial politics are sort of immediately injected into the Boston political discussion. I should say that the amendment does eventually pass. But Massachusetts is one of the last states in the North to ratify the 14th Amendment. And part of that is because of opposition from folks like Walker. Even though Walker himself, both Walker and Mitchell, are going to vote against ratification. Even though it does pass, they're going to oppose its ratification, even when it comes to the vote.
So the 15th Amendment also passes, which says that no one can be barred from voting based on race, color, previous condition of servitude, but yet somehow we end up without universal suffrage. And some of that, it sounds like, might have been due to white Republicans' fears of their fellow whites.
Yeah, I mean, this is the era of literacy requirements and in some states still property requirements. And some of that is about class. But I think also what it does is it opens up the opportunity for you. The 15th Amendment only prohibits blatantly racial prohibitions on voting. It doesn't establish the right to vote. Oftentimes people say, oh, the 15th Amendment gave African Americans the right to vote. Well, it doesn't in fact do that. It doesn't actually grant you a right.
As the next century of Southern politics will prove.
And really, like what Walker and others want in these debates over the 14th Amendment is they're not satisfied with what the 15th Amendment grants them. They want, they want citizenship and voting to be inseparable. They want, universal protected suffrage. And I think that as the story of, the tragic history of America is that without that sort of hard protection, white supremacists are very creative in finding ways to limit black voting.
So did Walker and his cohort of black leaders have the same reaction against the 15th that they did to the 14th, or was the focus really more on the 14th Amendment?
It is more on the 14th. They celebrate the 15th Amendment. When the 15th Amendment passes, it's very popular. I mean, there are big celebrations, but they still are skeptical. They're skeptical of that black voting will actually be protected beyond just this amendment. They are celebratory over the 15th Amendment. There still is this skepticism about what voting will mean. And so the other thing that they also want black office holding. I think that they know that it's not enough merely to have access to the ballot if you can't actually get you can't actually get a seat at the table politically. Edwin Walker famously says after the passage of the 15th Amendment that racism is really going to stand in the way of African Americans being able to really take advantage of any voting protection the 15th grants. Particularly, he's looking at Massachusetts and thinking about black political power and the ability of African Americans to gain official political positions in Massachusetts. I think they're still skeptical about what having the vote will mean for them.
So the fight over the 14th Amendment sort of reveals a lack of unity within the Republican Party, that black members of the party are starting to feel some skepticism toward the Republican Party. And then you point to 1872 as being a year when that really comes out into the open, that fissure within the Republican Party. And that's the year that Horace Greeley is going to run against Ulysses S. Grant, and then Benjamin Butler, Civil War general and somebody who we've featured on the podcast before, is going to try to find a sort of a third way politics in Massachusetts. Can you describe sort of what was happening in Boston in 1872 as these two different political campaigns are heating up?
Sure. So in 1872, famously, you have sort of Ulysses S. Grant running as an incumbent president. And then you have Horace Greeley running against him, not as a Democrat, but as sort of a separate party.
Splinter party.
Almost. Right. And they call it it's like the liberal Republican ticket. I don't want to go too much into the debate between Greeley and Grant, but that a lot of African Americans start to think about whether or not Greeley would be an avenue for their support. Charles Sumner famously will support Greeley. Charles Sumner, the famous sort of white Boston abolitionist and senator. And then others like Robert Morris will come out in favor of Greeley. And partly it's thinking about what the Republican Party has done and what it's going to do for the Republican Party. And so you start to see this question about what the political future for African Americans is going to be as far as partisanship. And there starts to be this discussion about whether or not African Americans are going to continue to be uncritical, loyal supporters of the Republican Party, or are they going to be willing to hold the Republican Party to account? And I think by 1872, you're also starting to see the continuation of atrocities and violence against African Americans in the South by white supremacists. There's a feeling growing among Black Bostonians that the federal government isn't doing enough to suppress that. That skepticism of the Republican Party begins to manifest, and it manifests in part towards the support of Greeley, not solely for Greeley's sake, but more as a willingness to show the Republican Party that African Americans are watching, and that if the Republican Party doesn't do something, if they're not more outspoken in favor of Black interests, Black voters are willing to go elsewhere.
And you have that same trend more locally with Benjamin Butler.
Right. So Butler comes on the scene as a candidate, and Butler, is famous. He's the general during the Civil War that helped protect fugitive slaves. He is famously in charge of New Orleans after the Union occupies New Orleans. And then he comes back to and is elected to Congress and is a very outspoken advocate of Black rights. He is one of the authors of the Civil Rights Act. He's endeared himself to the Boston's Black community as an advocate in Washington. And so he is a Republican initially, but because he switches a lot over the course of his career. But no, so it's really in 1872, Butler starts to come to Boston to speak to Black Bostonians.
And he runs for governor over and over, 1872, 78, I want to say.
Yeah, he runs sort of several years in a row until finally in the early 1880s when he wins as governor.
And by that time, has he switched parties to the Democratic Party? He
does. So he becomes a Democrat, at least for local purposes, by the 1880s.
And so then to still have strong African-American support, that has to be something of a watershed moment for Black voters to consider supporting Butler's Democratic candidacy for a party that had been historically pretty well arrayed against their interests, I think.
Yeah. And so, if there's cracks forming by, I sort of look at it as like, well, you start to see the cracks with Walker in 1866. As we get into the early 1870s, those cracks, we start to get a little wider. By the 1880s, those cracks have blown wide open. The end of federal Reconstruction with the Compromise of 1877 has really sort of brought some of these Black Bostonians' worst fears to light. This fear that for the sake of political expediency, the Republican Party is willing to sacrifice Black lives and Black rights, has sort of come to fruition. And they're watching the immediate flood, this sort of flood of renewed white supremacy and white supremacist violence across the South, and which they saw happening very early on. And so by the 1880s, folks like Walker, if they were toying with leaving the Republican Party, by the 1880s, their skepticism is fully established, and they really have declared their political independence by the 1880s, and that manifests in support for Butler as governor in 1882, and then in 1883. They really plant themselves firmly as Black independents willing to support whichever candidate, regardless of party, is going to represent their interests. And they decide in the early 1880s that candidate's going to be Benjamin Butler for governor.
After he's elected, Butler then nominates Walker as a district court judge, making him the first black judge, or would be making him the first black judge in Massachusetts. What does that tell us about what those interests of African-American voters were? I know you've pointed to patronage jobs, or sort of appointed jobs, and then also office holding as two major goals.
Yeah, so black office holding is incredibly important, not just in Boston, but generally. I mean, not only does it give you a voice directly in government decision making, but the symbolic value of black office holding is incredibly important. That the ability for, and they talk about this at the time, the ability of young African American children to see people who look like them in the halls of government, in the halls of power, is incredibly meaningful and important for black politics and for the black community. Appointed positions become incredibly important because so many electoral avenues are closed to them. So if they're going to gain footholds in formal spheres of government, it's going to be through these appointed positions. And so they watch very carefully what elected officials do when it comes to black appointments, and one of their big critiques of the Republican Party is that the Republican Party likes African Americans well enough as voters, but then doesn't appoint them to these positions, which it appoints other white supporters to. And so that's one of their major grievances when they talk about leaving the Republican Party. It's that the Republican Party doesn't appreciate them through the appointment to positions of power, which of course, political appointments are sort of part and parcel of machine politics. And they're watching the sort of white members of the political machine get these positions, but the black supporters are sort of left on the outside. And so that becomes a very major grievance, because black office holding has such a not only practical value, but also such an important symbolic value as a symbol of equality.
So what are some of the appointed offices we're talking about?
So African Americans are appointed to the Office of Weights and Measures. They're appointed to the Customs House. They're appointed to some positions, I think, within the fire department, police department. There are also some other positions, clerkships, and others within the State House that they're appointed to. And this is in addition to, keep in mind that during this period, African Americans are continuing to be elected to the State House. So during this period, you at least have one black representative in the general court during this era as well. But this Charlestown judgeship that opens in during Butler's term in 1883 is really that's a very important position, right? Because it's a judgeship, right? And so that becomes a major controversy during that election when Butler appoints Edwin Walker to the position, and the Republican-dominated executive council. So the way that Massachusetts government's laid out is you have a governor, but then you have an executive council that has to ratify appointments. And the executive council,
even though at this point Butler himself has switched to the Democratic Party, the council is still very heavily Republican. Right?
Yeah, there's enough Republican members on it to reject Walker's appointment. And this is seen as sort of a craven partisan act on the part of the Republicans, and really as a symbol of everything Walker has been saying, that the Republican Party doesn't actually care about African American interests. They're just interested in political expediency. I mean, this is just another piece of evidence that they don't want, and what Walker says is that they don't want to give Butler credit for appointing a black judge, particularly someone who's as outspoken against the Republican Party as Walker. And so Walker ends up not getting appointed to the position. And then after Butler is defeated in 1883, Butler's going to lose re-election to a Republican. He nominates George Ruffin. George Ruffin is an outspoken Republican partisan and is a very powerful voice on behalf of the Republican Party. And he's almost immediately approved as judge. And Ruffin, if you know about George Ruffin today, he's famously known as the first black judge in Massachusetts. And that has sort of cemented his legacy when that legacy could have been Walker's. And I think we would have told a very different history of Edwin Walker had he ascended to that position and not Ruffin.
So what does the confirmation of Ruffin tell the black community about where the political parties in Boston are going at that point?
For black independence, it shows that partisanship matters. That it's not about justice, it's not about equality. That partisanship is also has to be considered. That the fact that Ruffin is very easily approved is a sign that it was more than just race that played into it. It was also the political party that you're affiliated with matters. And so for independents, that is going to further solidify their position against the Republican Party. And then it's going to be more fuel to increase skepticism among some black Republicans towards independent politics. And so that I really point to this judicial appointment as one of those markers in the history of black independent politics in Boston that's going to then lead into the Cleveland election for president, when African Americans are going to support Grover Cleveland as president of the United States as a Democrat.
So Cleveland's running as a new kind of Democrat in 1884, respecting black rights, at least to some degree. So some black voters are going to support that. Others are still going to fear empowering this Democratic Party that since before the Civil War has been nakedly white supremacist. How do those two positions play out in the election among the African American community in Boston?
Sure. So I think for black independents and sort of following Butler's defeat, this cohort of black independents, which includes Walker, it's going to include James Trotter, are going to come together in an organization called the Sumner National Independent League. And that becomes their sort of political organization. And they are very outspoken through this league for Cleveland's election. Their strategy is that if you can get enough black voters to support Democratic candidates, Northern Democratic candidates will start looking to black voters as a way to gain inroads in the North. And in order to do that, they're going to have to come to the table on black civil rights. And that if you could get enough Northern Democrats to support a civil rights agenda, that would potentially push out white supremacist Democrats in the South. And so their grand strategy is that if you can get enough African Americans can be seen by the Democratic Party as a viable constituency, that would force the party to have to support a civil rights agenda that would then sort of push the white supremacists out of the party. So that's sort of their grand plan, and they are sort of excited by Grover Cleveland, as Cleveland is from New York. He represents a slightly moderate vision of the Democratic Party. And so they view, even though, Cleveland isn't necessarily seen as a huge boomer of black civil rights, he does, through some of the appointments he does, through some others, he's seen at least there's some hope that Cleveland could be the beginning of this change within the Democratic Party. So there is some optimism on the part of black Democrats. For black Republicans, this is a nightmare. For black Republicans, there is a view that as soon as you put Democrats in power, this is going to be the end. That the Democratic Party is the party of white supremacy. Don't let anybody fool you into thinking that they're moderate. As soon as Democrats get in power, the white supremacist wave is going to come north from the South and take over everything. And so they view the idea of black support of the Democratic Party is so frightening that they're incredibly outspoken about it. They publish a newspaper, the Boston Hub, that is, Lewis Hayden in his final years. Lewis Hayden, the famous Black abolitionist, is going to rail against independent politics. There's a fear that as soon as you open the door for the Democratic Party, that's going to mean out and out white supremacy, and particularly white supremacist violence, and the end of all the gains that they've fought so hard for. So you have these two sides come together during these elections.
So Cleveland does get elected, and does he live up to the hype? Does he make appointments of African Americans? Does he protect civil rights in the Democratic South? How does his presidency measure up to the campaign?
I mean, so I think that it's not the watershed. It's not the watershed one way or the other. I think it's not a new era of equality, nor is it, nor does it mean the end of the world. I think that Cleveland sort of he neglects Black rights, which means that he's not going to interfere in some of the actions that are happening in the South, which means that the rising tide of Jim Crow and of white supremacist violence is going to continue. He does, however, appoint James Trotter to replace Frederick Douglass as Recorder of Deeds for Washington, D.C. So Frederick Douglass famously has a position in Washington, D.C., very prominent public position in Washington, D.C. as Recorder of Deeds. Douglass is no longer in that position. There is a big move from Boston to have one of their own appointed to that position. And James Trotter, another famous African-American independent in Boston, is going to be appointed by Cleveland to fill that position.
Now, our listeners will have met James's son, William Monroe Trotter, but we haven't really talked about James on the show before. Can you just introduce us to him? Yeah,
so James Trotter he's a Civil War veteran, eventually lands in Boston, in Massachusetts, and becomes a very popular public political actor and leader in Black Boston, but very, very outspoken as a political independent, very close ally of Edwin Garrison Walker. And I think you see the sort of outspokenness of William Monroe Trotter is, I believe, very much in the tradition of his father, that he, as a child, would have seen his father's political activity, and he very much follows in James's footsteps. And so James Trotter sort of cements the success of independent politics when he is appointed to this position in Washington, and very much there's hope that what has happened with Trotter is the beginning of this victory of independent politics. But of course, that doesn't happen. And by the end of Cleveland's term and by the end of the 1880s, the hope that you were going to find a sort of transformed, moderated Democratic Party, it's fairly clear that that's not going to happen. It also becomes increasingly clear that the Republican Party is not going to be the vehicle and not going to be the strong advocate for Black rights either. And so by the end of the 1880s, we start to see Black independents sort of skeptical of either party as an avenue. If the story of Black independent politics in the 1880s is one of hope in the Democratic Party, the story of the 1890s is going to be sort of a cynicism towards the two-party system generally, and a need to strike outside of the two political parties when it comes to Black political organizing.
Now, before we get into the 1890s, you spent a fairly good chunk of the book right at the end of the 1880s focusing on a sort of a surprising political coalition in Boston. And you introduce it by describing Black and Irish Bostonians marching together for the unveiling of the Crispus Attucks monument on the Common. Can you talk a little bit about how Crispus Attucks becomes a uniting force for these two very different groups?
Yeah, so this is November 1888. The monument to Crispus Attucks is inaugurated. Famously, for those of you in Boston, if you want to visit it, it's prominent on the side of the Boston Common, just down from the Park Street station. you can find this obelisk, and this is the monument we're talking about here. That Crispus Attucks becomes this unifying figure, and that famously if you know the Boston Massacre, it's not just Crispus Attucks who's killed, but also several other protesters, including a Irish Bostonian who's also killed on that day. And so the Boston Massacre has this symbolic value for African Americans. It's a powerful image of Black participation in the founding moments of the nation. For Irish Bostonians, it's also about participation in this revolutionary moment, but it's also about resistance to British tyranny. In the 1880s, if you know your Irish history, the 1880s is also a very strong period in Irish independence. And so the Boston Massacre is seen by Irish Bostonians as a moment of resistance to British tyranny. And so it's a symbol that allows Black and Irish to come together and sort of unite these two freedom struggles. If on the one side of the Atlantic you have a struggle for Irish freedom within the British Empire, in the United States you also have a struggle for Black freedom within the United States. And Crispus Attucks becomes this symbol that in the shape of a physical monument is going to bring together these two freedom struggles in a very physical way. And one of the hopes I have through writing this book was that we might talk about this monument in a slightly different way, that we might talk about it not only as a monument to the fallen victims of the Boston Massacre, but also as a monument to this moment of Black and Irish unity.
That unity goes beyond just the monument. You say that as early as the 1860s, Edwin Walker was counting on Irish support when he was running for state legislature. And then in the other direction, Hugh O'Brien, the first Irish mayor of Boston, sounds like he was also relying on African-American support in his campaign.
Yeah, so Hugh O'Brien is elected as Boston's first Irish-born mayor. Before he becomes a mayor, he's on the city council, and in this position is an advocate of Black political positions. He appoints some African Americans to office, and so when he's running for mayor, he taps the Black Bostonians as a constituency, and Patrick McGuire, who's a political strategist, among other things, is going to give speeches to the Black community, advocating the support of O'Brien in his first election in 1884. You're going to get what are called colored O'Brienite clubs forming in the city, and these are clubs dedicated to Black support of O'Brien. And then once O'Brien is elected, there's going to be a lot of hope in O'Brien as a representative not only of the Irish community but also of the Black community in the mayor's office. And O'Brien does attempt to appoint some African Americans to office, and so you see the support of Hugh O'Brien and of the sort of Black of the Irish political machine generally. There's sort of this moment in the 1880s where Black independents join with the sort of Irish political machine in this history.
So the dedication of the Attucks statue is almost the culmination of this partnership that's been growing for over a decade at that point.
Yeah, and I really point to sort of two areas that come to fruition in the Attucks monument. And one is this political support, electoral support for Hugh O'Brien, but the other is the Black support of Irish independence. And Walker's a major proponent of this. There's a lot of support for Irish independence among African Americans as part of this sort of transatlantic freedom struggle, that they look to the Irish struggle against British tyranny in Ireland as similar to their own. And there's this hope among some African Americans that through the support of Black independence through the support of Irish independence, that Irish Bostonians, even Irish in Ireland, would support the Black freedom struggle. And so African Americans in Boston, they campaign for Irish independence. They're going to famously hold a benefit concert to raise money for Charles Parnell's Home Rule Fund. And so in some very real ways, they view themselves as supporters of Irish independence in the hope that that's going to bring Irish Bostonians to their cause. And that's seen in the Crispus Attucks Monument. So the Crispus Attucks Monument, I argue, is sort of a byproduct of not only the political success that they've had through the election of Hugh O'Brien, but also through the joining of these two freedom struggles. That manifests itself in that physical monument.
And I guess as a reaction to that, to those freedom struggles being joined, it seems like old Yankee Boston isn't as thrilled about the idea of a Crispus Attucks monument as some other populations. You would think, for example, a group like our friends at the Massachusetts Historical Society would enthusiastically endorse a monument to massacre victim Crispus Attucks, but it seems like that support wasn't universal.
Yeah, no, and this is all credit to the Massachusetts Historical Society, who I did some great research there, but this was a long time ago. Yeah, Massachusetts Historical Society comes out, and this is among others, against the monument to Crispus Attucks and the Boston Massacre because in their mind, the Boston Massacre is not a noble story. It's the story of basically a riot and a bunch of ruffians, and why should we be memorializing this riot? And part of the conditions of this monument is that it's raised with public money. And so a lot of the other monuments that we see around Boston are privately fundraised. The Crispus Attucks monument is built with public money. And part of the critique is that public money shouldn't be used to build a monument to rioters and hoodlums. It should, this is not the noble revolutionary history that a particular class of Bostonians wants to portray. What that ends up doing is fueling a lot of the Irish anger towards this. It's viewed as a very pro-British stance. They talk about Tory Boston as opposing the monument, and then it's also, these are also Republicans who are opposing this monument, right? And so I think for proponents of independent politics, this is another sign that when push comes to shove, white Republicans aren't going to support something even as sort of noble and as a monument to Crispus Attucks. The critique of the monument by white Boston, I think, ends up sort of fueling some of the sort of continued skepticism of how deep the support for Black interest actually is in the city.
Yeah, you describe after the unveiling of the statue, there were actually two different celebratory parties that night, one at the Parker House restaurant and another at Ebenezer Baptist Church. Why were there two different parties?
Yeah, so there's one that's sort of like the official event, which has the governor and the mayor and all this, and the rhetoric of that event is very optimistic, right? It's about equality, and that this monument is a sign that race relations are great, and that everybody is free and equal. And look, we have this monument to show for it. The members who are attending that party are sort of the official political leadership. So you have the Julius Chappelle, who's a Republican elected official, Black Boston. You have Lewis Hayden. You have some of these other sort of. It's a official ceremony. It's also a very Republican ceremony, apart from Hugh O'Brien. Down the street in the Knights of Pythias fraternal organization, you have another meeting, and this includes George Downing, who's also a outspoken Black independent, and Edwin Walker. And their attitude is a little bit more sanguine. They are not as triumphant. I think that they view Crispus Attucks as an inspiration and as a call to action. That Crispus Attucks is a symbol of revolution. Crispus Attucks is a symbol for the future of the movement. They don't view the construction of this monument as a triumph. They view it as an inspiration for continued action. And so I think you can see this contrast between the sort of continued skepticism and agitation on the part of Black independent politics that's going to fuel them into the 1890s.
So this seems to be a time when the independent movement's undergoing sort of a generational change. From your book, I would sort of take that to 1887 and a new group called the Colored National League. Can you describe what that organization was and then what that meant for electoral politics around Boston?
Yeah, so by the end of the 1880s, you're going to, in 1887, this organization called the Colored National League is formed. And it's a Black political organization dedicated to a sort of national Black political struggle, similar to, there's what's known as the Afro-American League, which is T. Thomas Fortune, who's out of New York. That's another large movement. So this is really an era of Black political organizing, and Boston is a part of this history through the Colored National League. But the Colored National League, sort of, as you say, sort of represents a new stage in Black politics. No longer do you sort of have these other political organizations geared more towards partisan politics. The Colored National League, even though they maintain an interest in electoral politics, it's very much seen as its own entity sitting outside of the formal political system. And so even as much as the Colored National League is this new generation, somebody like Edwin Walker is going to be very prominent in its early years as a leader. So in some ways, it blends this new generation along with the older generation. But it's very much ushers in this era of the Black political organization that sits outside of the two parties. And so the way that I tell the narrative is that by the 1890s, African Americans are starting to lose hope that there's an avenue within official political party structures, and so they strike out on their own. And the Colored National League is going to be one of these entities that's going to attempt to marshal Black political interests in a way that's sort of extra electoral.
Part of the impetus behind sort of striking out independent of the political parties was probably due to a reunification between Democrats and Republicans, white Democrats and white Republicans. They were very focused on sort of national unity of whites at the expense of African American civil rights. Especially, it seems like there was a fight over an election law in 1889 that might have solidified that.
Yeah, so in 1889, there is an attempt to pass a federal elections law to protect Black voting. And that is defeated. It doesn't end up becoming law, and that's a sign that any hope that you've had in this Democratic Party, even some of these Northern Democrats ultimately playing out in meaningful legislation, isn't going to happen. And that really, so like by 1890, you start to get Black independents have sort of lost hope that the Southern arm of the Democratic Party was on the run. That by the defeat of the federal elections law really shows that Southern Democrats are in charge, and any hope of moderating influence in that party, that hope starts to be eroded. But then further, the inability of Republicans within Congress to be outspoken and get anything done is a symbol of that. The failure of that party. And so by the 1890s, as you mentioned, there is a trend away from Black civil rights as far in white-dominated politics. There's an attempt more towards building the economy, building industry, and cementing reunification. To discuss Black civil rights at a federal level is too divisive, and it'll stand in the way of unity and of economic progress, and that really comes at the expense of African Americans. So, simultaneous to these changes happening politically, this is also the era of lynching, and so we're going to start to see this take a real toll, not just on Black rights but on Black lives. So that the inability of federal political leadership to take a stand results in real devastating consequences for African Americans, particularly in the South, but also nationally.
Lynching is remembered as a primarily a Southern problem, but it sounds like Boston's African American community was very involved in the fight against lynching and the attempts to pass anti-lynching laws. How did Northern African Americans, local Boston African Americans, get involved in the national fight against lynching?
Throughout this whole period, African Americans in Boston, they view themselves and their rights as sort of inseparable to what's happening in the South. And so everything that they do is always with one eye on the South. And so when they see the sort of increase in white supremacist violence in the South, that is another sort of rallying cry, particularly when they see sort of federal inaction to this violence. And so they'll form organizations. In addition to the Colored National League, they form it's called the Massachusetts Racial Protection Association, that is formed also as an explicit anti-lynching organization. They're going to be one of the first cities to support someone like Ida B. Wells, very famous Southern journalist, but also national and international anti-lynching advocate. They raise money, they write letters, they are very powerfully outspoken against anti-lynching at a time when, in a lot of communities, talking about lynching was still not as popular. Boston is very outspoken in its anti-lynching advocacy to the point at which they get attention from the South.
You describe a very well publicized meeting at Faneuil Hall in 1895, where the Massachusetts Racial Protective Association is advocating against lynching, and then this really strong reaction in the Southern press. How did the Southern press cover that event?
Yeah, it's kind of amazing that that was something that I didn't think I was going to find, and that when there's this famous speech or famous rally in Boston, and that it's followed up in a Texas newspaper and some other newspapers that report on this as, this is just an example of, these sort of, Northern Bostonian attitude. They don't have any idea what's happening in the South. They need to mind their own business. If they want to get into the business, they should come down here and we'll show them what the business is really about. And so they threaten Bostonians. They threaten the mayor of Boston for being a part of this meeting, and then they attempt to defend themselves. They attempt to defend the lynching that they are doing through a protection of white womanhood. This is a moment where we really see that this is not just like an isolated Boston story, but what Boston is doing is getting attention nationally, and that Boston is seen as one of the hubs, for lack of a better word, of this anti-lynching advocacy, even by the perpetrators themselves. Yeah, and so it really this helps put Boston sort of increasingly more on the map as a site of racial justice and anti-lynching advocacy.
And there's a wing of that anti-lynching movement that turns really very radical. I know you quoted Reverend Walter Gay as saying, "We've preached to our people to desist from retaliation. Now I say to my race, find revenge if we have to use the torch. Find revenge if we have to cut the throats of those white Southerners who rape our women. Retaliate, I say. Take life for life." Is that emblematic of the anti-lynching movement broadly, or is that a sort of a narrow thread?
I mean, I think that it's emblematic, I think, of the frustration and the tragic moment that African Americans find themselves in. I think that there's this feeling that the country has abandoned them, the federal government has abandoned them, the Republican Party has abandoned them, and the only way that the only possible way forward would be through self-defense. And even though we don't see a Boston militia form and go south, I think that this rhetoric is very emblematic of how bad things have gotten, that African Americans no longer have hope in nonviolent avenues, that they're being pushed by an unwillingness to act on the part of the federal government in particular towards potential self-defense.
So we've already talked about sort of the efforts to reunify white Americans after the Civil War, leading politicians away from black civil rights. But it seems like the anti-lynching movement helps to point out just how far that has gone. You describe in 1896, there was a really just terrible, brutal, in 1898, the lynching of a South Carolina postmaster and almost his entire family. And then activists start advocating to bring the surviving members of his family to Boston. And I feel like that was very revealing of a gulf between black and white activists in Boston.
Yeah. So in 1898, in February of 1898, Fraser Baker, who's a black postmaster in South Carolina, his home and his family are brutally attacked. An armed mob sets his house on fire. And as him and his family are attempting to leave, they shoot up the building so that you imagine you have this like family trying to flee the building. Bullets are flying through the house. Fraser Baker ends up dying. Their youngest child ends up being shot as the mother, Lavinia Baker, is trying to carry Julia out of the building. A bullet kills the baby, and the baby falls into the fire. It's this sort of horribly tragic and horrific event. But I should say emblematic of similar types of violence happening throughout the South. So as horrific as the Baker lynching is, I wish we could say that it was unique to South Carolina, but I think it's one of many lynchings that are occurring.
In our episode about the David Walker's appeal, we read from a publication that W.E.B. Du Bois put out just about a decade after this long list of the lynchings and racial violence across the South. It's as horrifying a thing as you ever want to read.
Yeah, and so I think that's to say that the Baker lynching brings sort of all of lynching home to Boston. So the Baker family, Lavinia Baker and some of the children survive. And there's an attempt by Black Bostonians, by the Colored National League, to bring them to Boston, to get them out of South Carolina for their own safety, but also just for recovery and to get them out of the South, bring them to Boston. I should say before I go into this that nobody is ever convicted for the Baker lynching. That ultimately no one is held responsible for that, which is also sadly not unique for the era.
That's the case in most lynchings, it seems.
Yeah. So there's an attempt to bring the Baker family north to Boston. In the rally to bring this family north, there is a conflict between black and white activists, and in particular between black activists and Lillian Jewett. So Lillian Jewett is a white woman, very much styles herself after Harriet Beecher Stowe, as sort of a white female advocate of the race, and so she attempts to. She also becomes sort of outspoken to bring this family north, and that creates some tension among the black supporters, particularly Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, who is she's the wife of George Ruffin, but in her own right is a powerful black political activist, outspoken political speaker and editor of the Women's Era black newspaper. She sort of takes the lead on bringing the Baker family north, and she's very outspoken against Lillian Jewett taking over this movement. There's a fear that Jewett is taking what was a black-led movement and taking that away from them. That she wants people to know that it was African Americans who first talked about bringing this family north. It was African Americans that were the outspoken opponents of lynching, and that this should be their cause. That they've too often, by the 1890s, seen white so-called political allies co-opt black movements and take it away from them. And so Ruffin makes some very powerful statements against Jewett and very much wants this to remain a Black-led operation. And I think that dovetails nicely with the electoral discussion, where increasingly by the end of the 1880s, there's this sense that African Americans can no longer depend on white political leadership for progress. That if racial progress is going to be achieved, it's going to be achieved with Black leaders in charge and with Black leadership and Black activists driving the movement. And so what happens around the Baker lynching is emblematic of something that's happening in greater Black politics, which is an increasing turn towards Black political autonomy, what's going to be eventually called Black nationalism. This sense that if the Black freedom struggle is going to succeed, it's going to succeed at Black hands, that you cannot depend on white allies any longer. And that just like your belief in the loyalty to the Republican Party was misplaced, similarly, by placing your faith in somebody like Helen Jewett is also misplaced, that African Americans can now only depend on themselves.
So along those lines, a year before his death, Edwin Walker actually runs for president himself in the election of 1900. And spoiler alert, is not elected. William McKinley gets reelected there. But he's running on the ticket of a new political party. So what does that mean for the state of African American politics in Boston at this sort of turn of the century moment?
Yeah, so in the 1900 political election, Edwin Walker is going to serve on the ticket for the National Negro Party with PBS Pinchback, who is a famous African-American Louisiana lieutenant governor. Who also attends the dedication of the Crispus Attucks Monument. Edwin Walker runs for president as part of this National Negro Party. It's a very small party. It's hard to find much about it. But this is really Walker's ultimate break from the two-party system. That he says that neither party is going to support Black interests, and that it would be better for African Americans either to not vote at all or to vote for their own party. That there is no longer any hope in the Republican Party or in the Democratic Party, and that he's watching by the 1900 the conditions of African Americans nationally, but especially in the South, really deteriorate. And he lays the blame sort of wholly at the feet of the federal government and wholly at the feet of Republican leadership. Now, particularly McKinley. McKinley is a Republican, and I think there's some hope that McKinley is going to do something about lynching. McKinley famously takes a tour of the South and doesn't talk about lynching. And I think that that's a huge blow to African Americans. This idea that you now have a Republican back in the presidency, and he's not going to do anything to prevent these sort of Southern atrocities, and that really cements, what was this sort of this opposition to the Republican Party and to party politics that has been present throughout the late 19th century. By the turn of the 20th century, that has pretty much proved justified. That by the 20th century, not only has the inability of the federal government of the Republican Party to act cost Black rights, but it's cost Black lives, and that now there's no hope any longer of finding solace in the political parties. The only option is for African Americans to head out on their own and forge new separate political organizations.
Really a bleak time for Black politics, that anti-lynching laws have basically failed. Over the next couple of decades, lynching is going to reach an all-time high. Jim Crow is going to get codified. The KKK reforms in the South and in the North, as we saw in a recent episode about the Klan in Boston. You both open and close the book with Edwin Garrison's funeral, and you have a statement that his life, in a way, frames the experience of Black independent politics. What does the arc of that life mean to you in terms of the politics of Boston?
I think it's really sad. I think that Walker represents the sort of hope and potential of the Reconstruction moment. I think that he comes in when he's elected to office in 1866. He's really holding account, the nation in a lot of ways to say, like, if you mean what you say by what you want out of Reconstruction, you need to show it in very meaningful ways. And he continues to beat that drum and continues, not to support the Republican Party at very severe, personal and professional cost. When he ultimately dies, I think it, like, with him, dies the hope that there is space for civil rights advocacy within electoral politics and within the two-party politics, particularly at any sort of national level. I think they do find some success locally, but that party politics is not going to be the avenue for national transformation that they had hoped. And I think that, with Walker's death, the 20th century struggle is born. We see echoes of Walker, echoes of James Trotter in the work of W.B. Du Bois, in the formation of the Niagara Movement, in the formation of the NAACP. These black political independent organizations, indeed, I think, are the legacy of folks like Walker. And I think we would do well to remember, men like Walker, women like Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. They have their roots, both physically and politically, and in this generation, ideologically in this generation. Yeah.
Thank you very much for doing this, for sticking it out through what's turning out to be a rather long conversation. This is a time period and a topic that I didn't know much about before reading the book, so it's been very educational for me, and it's a great book for anybody like me who doesn't know much about Black politics in Boston in the late 19th century. Before I let you go, is there any place our readers can find out more about you and your work?
I have a website that not only talks about the book, but also some other things that I've written about African Americans in Boston and sort of Black civil rights of this era generally. If you just go to www.millingtonbl.com, you can find more about it that way. There's also a link to get in touch with me. You can also look at raceoverparty.com. We'll also take you there. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great opportunity to tell the story. I'm really passionate about sharing this story, not only of Boston's history, but of the life of men like Edwin Garrison Walker, who I think are important members of the Black Bostonian pantheon of heroes, in addition to being national figures. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Dr. Millington Bergeson-Lockwood, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
To learn more about this topic, or to get more details on Millington's book, Race Over Party, Black Politics and Partisanship in Late 19th-Century Boston, check out this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/154. We'll have links to Dr. Bergeson-Lockwood's website and social media profiles, and of course, we'll have a link to buy his book. We'll also have a link to information about our upcoming event, Puritans in Print, from the Partnership of Historic Bostons. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at podcast@hubhistory.com. You can call and leave a voicemail at 617-383-9255, and we'd love to play your audio feedback on the show. We are Hub History on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, or just go to hubhistory.com and click on the Contact Us link. While you're on the site, hit the subscribe link and be sure that you never miss an episode. If you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, please consider writing a brief review. And if you do, drop us a line, and we'll send you a Hub History sticker as a token of our appreciation. That's all for now. We'll be back next week.